I think there's a bit of a misperception about what a wellbeing program should be, and even if a company should have a wellbeing program, or really should there be no wellbeing program, but people's feelings of being well and being healthy and being productive and performing at their best should really just be outcomes of a great employee experience. In the companies I've worked for and the thought leadership and the research and everything that I've seen over the years, it kind of works best and enhances a company's culture most when you have the charismatic megafauna at the top, like the pandas of the workplace, who are able to champion and advocate and inspire people towards this concept of not just bananas and running shoes, but the whole workplace being designed so that it facilitates a sense of well-being in individuals.
Well, hello and welcome. Welcome to another episode of the Finding Equilibrium Show. I'm delighted you're here, delighted that I'm here, and delighted that my guest today is Breckon Jones. And Breckon wears two hats, two kind of very big hats, in fact. So Breckon is and I want to get this right, you're head of talent experience at Deloitte. And so that's clearly a huge role. And you're also a board advisor for a number of different HR tech companies. So I'm keen to learn more about both of those. But maybe as a starting point, I'd love you to just share, for people who are not familiar with your work, your journey to how did you become head of talent experience for Deloitte. I'd love to know a little bit about your background.
Sure, happy to do so, Lawrence. And let me say thank you so much for having me today and giving me the opportunity to share my story, but also a little bit more about what I do with those two hats on. And I probably wear even more hats than that, but maybe we just talk about those two for today because we've only got limited amount of time. But to answer your question, what do I do with those hats on? So day to day, I'm a member of the Deloitte Australia HR leadership team. And I look after a team that's responsible for shaping our employee experience, the 13,000 employees that we have in Australia, shaping that day-to-day experience and all of those transactions and processes and things that people do while they're at work. My team's responsible for making sure that that's a great experience, but also that we can be drawing out data and insights from how all of those processes work and the different initiatives that we run to shape the culture, and then using that data to make it even better each year. So that's kind of the day job, one hat that I wear. And then the side hustle hat, I guess you'd call it, that I wear is over the last few years, I've been a board advisor to a few HR startups and HR tech companies. The one in particular at the moment that I'm focused on is a performance technology platform from CrewMojo. And the role that I play really in that advisory capacity is to say, as a buyer and an internal HR leader, what would be the advice that I would give to founders who are creating technologies that go towards enabling great employee experiences. And mostly these days, as a result of the pandemic, those experiences are digital, sometimes 100% digital and sometimes in part digital, but certainly HR technology is here to stay. It has been for a while. And as we progress in this new way of working, it's going to be even more fundamental to how people experience a company's culture. And the second part, I think, of your question there in the intro was, how did I get to be in this position? So I've worked in HR for 20 years now, and I've worked in Australia and I've worked in the UK and the US, and I've always had a deep interest in health and well-being and performance, and that was sort of born out of a love of sport, but also a curiosity about people and psychology. And so that's, I studied sports psychology at university. I thought I was going to work with athletes on the field, but I got this opportunity to switch gears and come and work in offices. But a lot of those principles of sports psychology, I thought, translated very well into the HR agenda. And really the passion of mine over those 20 years has been about well-being and what does that actually mean, and how do you factor that into the way in which you shape a company's culture.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I want to pick up on one word that we hear a lot of in the work that I do, which is holistic. And often we see as a trend that we need to look at the whole employee. Wellbeing initiatives need to be holistic. When I say those words to you, what does that mean? And how do you know whether you have a holistic strategy around wellbeing and around employee engagement? And how does it link into the performance of the business?
Yeah, I think when I hear the word holistic in the context of well-being, sometimes I have a bit of an allergic reaction, even though I use it myself. But I think there's a bit of a misperception about what a well-being program should be, and even if a company should have a well-being program, or really should there be no well-being program, but people's feelings of being well and being healthy and being productive and performing at their best should really just be outcomes of a great employee experience. And so when I think about taking an holistic approach to designing everything that's within a workplace experience, I'm wanting for one of the outcomes and one of the measures to be that this sense of well-being is not just about that there's more bananas and people wearing running shoes in the workplace, but that we are considering a whole lot more factors that might be drivers of how people feel and how they perform at work, but also outside of work, right? Because you can't just leave yourself at the door when you get to the office, and vice versa. You can't leave work at work when you come home anymore, especially not when, like me and many others were working from home most of the time. So for me, yeah, it's not just about, okay, this is the fitness program, or this is an on-site gym, or here's flu vax that you do. It's about thinking much more broadly about what can shape the experience of people so that work is actually better for people and not detrimental to them.
I think I love that. And I guess the question that comes to mind immediately is, so if the experience of an employee is impacted by everything, as an HR leader, how do you manage that? Because it's much easier to manage bowls of bananas and organizing running challenges, picking up an examples, than it is to manage like everything, like the entire experience. Because I completely agree, but it can feel a bit overwhelming from the perspective of an HR leader. So
yeah, and I take that point seriously, and I've heard that before, and it also depends on the scale of the company as well. And I think there are a lot of nuances when it comes to workplace wellbeing. It depends on the country or the countries that you're responsible for. Depends on how you organize and how you divide up your human resource team. And where does wellbeing sit is a question that I've quite often been asked when I've been in conferences on panels, and my response to that is always, well, it shouldn't sit anywhere really. You should always be standing up as much as you can and moving around. But jokes aside, it's kind of one of those things where it doesn't really matter so long as there's something and there's some consideration for this concept of work being good for people and not being bad for people, for want of a better phrase. And in all of the companies that I've worked for over the years, I've seen a wellbeing team or a wellbeing strategy or a wellbeing agenda sitting in multiple different parts of the business, not just HR. Sometimes you find it in the corporate social responsibility and public affairs team, because it's more about communicating events or an ethos of a product, which is well-being or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's in occupational health and safety, and then that will mean that it's sort of shaped in a slightly different way, where well-being then gets kind of tacked on at the end of the safety agenda, which is fine as well. Or then sometimes it's in reward. Sometimes it's in the inclusion and diversity team. Sometimes it's everywhere else. But it sort of should be one of those things that sits nowhere but everywhere. And ultimately, it works best, I think, when you have the kind of the top-down advocacy and leadership. I've seen it as a grassroots, bottom-up. Employees asking for this, calling for it, and then it coming. But in the companies I've worked for and the thought leadership and the research and everything that I've seen over the years, it kind of works best and enhances a company's culture most when you have the charismatic megafauna at the top, like the pandas of the workplace, who are able to champion and advocate and inspire people towards this concept of not just bananas and running shoes, but the whole workplace being designed so that it facilitates a sense of well-being in individuals.
Okay, and within that whole workplace, because you're including, I'm assuming, things like the actual job that people do, like the job, the design of their jobs, as well as the things that you can actually measure, and that can feel again, how do you influence that as an HR leader if you know that people's job design, and there's been a lot of work around job design over the last couple of years because everything is changing, but how do you do that? Like, how do you influence if you know that people are doing jobs that are not necessarily going to be good for them because they're not resourced to do that? How would you, from an HR perspective or well-being perspective, be able to kind of influence that that change?
Yeah, certainly a challenge. And I think, that's why safety quite often is the foundation of a lot of the approaches that companies take towards an offering of well-being, because you want people to be safe fundamentally. You don't want the jobs that they do to injure them or, even worse. And so therefore, I think that kind of, is the job safe? Is the environment safe? Has it been designed in such a way that ill harm is not going to be the kind of natural effect that comes from performing this job? And of course, we're fortunate in Australia and a lot of developed countries that is a legislative requirement that jobs have to meet a certain standard of safety and keep that. But that's not always the case in all countries, unfortunately. But then you kind of look at those different levels, and often we see the job design of being based on kind of Maslow's hierarchy of need, where you've got safety and sort of security at the bottom, and then you kind of go up a bit, and it's more about do people have the levels of autonomy and control over their day and their hours and when they can take a break, or do they have natural light into their offices or into the factory or whatever else they might be? And then you can kind of layer up on top of that yet again and say, do people have the opportunities to grow and develop, and do they have learning that helps them to become more fungible and sort of build up their personal value to be able to do something differently or do something better? And then all the way up to the top, where people kind of can build this sense of self-efficacy, where they have all of everything below them. They might be custodians of people's careers because they're a people leader and they're sort of responsible for the job design and the jobs of others. And they can almost become those coaches and leaders and champions and advocates that helps to spread that even more broadly. So I think it's a fascinating topic to talk about, and you will know this well from all the people that you've spoken about. It is very, very complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. And I think there are sort of like certain things that you want to consider as you design all of these cultural initiatives that will be common, but then they'll be nuanced based on what country you're in or what company you're in or what place or time or all of those sorts of things that you're in.
No, I love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So just moving on, and you talked about the number of people at Deloitte that you're responsible for in terms of their experience. So that seems enormous. And I'd love to understand how you track that, like what data you actually use to be able to understand, whether the experience of people is good, not so good, like where the areas of improvements could be.
Yeah. So 13,000 people roughly in Australia are in Deloitte, but over 350,000 globally in one organization.
Wow.
Big company. I've worked for very big companies in the past, like Unilever and American Express, that operate in 50, 100 different companies. And the differences and the nuance between those and the scale can kind of add complexity. But the one thing I think that all of them have in common is that, what gets measured typically gets enhanced, right? And so that's been something that I've focused on in this role when I started here 4 years ago, is thinking about any of the employee experience or culture building initiatives that we want to offer. What's the measure of success, or the measures of success? And that's not just, how many employees are picking up bananas out of the fruit bowl, or how many people are going to the running events. It's thinking much more holistically again about what is the people data that's being generated from all of the stuff in the employee life cycle. How do you harness that, and how do you mine it, and how do you draw insight from it? And how can you then tell stories with it as you keep iterating on different business cases to justify wanting to do more, or do things differently, or do things better? And so I think it's been a bit of a task and a journey here at Deloitte to evolve our offering in that space. And Deloitte's very good at recommending to our clients about how you can capture your people data, and how you can build dashboards and use tools and make decisions based on that data. But many years ago, we weren't as good at doing that internally. I think we've come a long way now. And what was fascinating for me a few years back, when we started looking at how do we evolve our reporting functions into more of a deep analytics and even predictive analytics team and offering, was that not a lot of companies in Australia tend to do it very well either. And there is a huge opportunity for companies to really think more about what is the people data culture that you have or that you want to build. How do you take all of that gut feel and the anecdotes that HR people tend to operate very, very well from, and how do you level that up by actually bringing in data into the equation to justify the decision making and give better advice to leaders and to your internal clients? And it's actually one of the things that I've been really focused on with CrewMojo, this tech company that I mentioned earlier that I'm advising at the moment. Their focus is very much on performance and having a performance platform. But what is also a demand that their clients are finding is, to take that performance, which is an essential element of an HR offering, and some of the core people data that is required in order to manage a performance process, and turn that into a basic people data and analytics offering that's really easy, that sort of says, here's our headcount now, and here's what it was a year ago. Here's our turnover now, here's what it was last month. Here's how many people are participating in these wellbeing initiatives, or, here's our gender split of males to females. There's a whole lot in there that can be easily packaged up, that can allow people to make simple and effective decisions about their people processes and the choices they make about how they hire and how they motivate people to perform.
That's really interesting. So at Deloitte, are there a few key metrics that you track regularly, as well as all of the data that you described and mining that? Like in your dashboard, do you have a few KPIs that you'll track religiously and report up the line?
Yeah, there's certainly core ones. And actually what's interesting is, and a lot of HR people do this, they will provide a lot of people data points for leaders, but without actually considering what leaders want and need. So we've tried to find a nice equilibrium and balance between all of the cool data that we think is going to be important, that leaders need to make the right people decisions, but also the sort of stuff that the decision makers and the business leaders are saying, well, actually, I would rather know the following. And so that's like trying to find that balance between the two. But if I was to pinpoint a few of the core ones that would be in our dashboards currently, you're looking at things like headcount trends, particularly in a growth environment when we're growing in certain places and we've got hot skills and hot jobs that are in high demand. So we're wanting to look at that kind of pre-hire data, that recruitment data of what's the talent pipeline and how does that translate into headcount and how many people are being hired. How is that offset by the number of people who are exiting through the voluntary turnover and other factors there? And what does that then mean for the shape of our organization when you look by business unit or by job level or by job family, those sorts of things. A key data point as well for us is the gender split and the gender diversity within our organization, so male and females and non-binary and other. And how is that then translating into our leadership pipeline? So are we making sure that we have enough females coming through our succession planning to eventually be in those key management roles? And that's a very big focus area for Deloitte at the moment as part of our all-in strategy, which is making sure that we have sufficient gender balance as you go up the chain, but also that there are benefits and rewards that encourage and motivate both females and males to come and to stay. So that's a really key one for us. Employee engagement is a key one as well for us. So, we have a continuous listening strategy where we ask our people about what they feel and what they need and what they want from the organization. It's sort of two-way. And they give us feedback on what's working and how likely they are to stay or go. And so we have these metrics within that we serve up that sort of give us an indication of whether people are likely to stay and are they going to go above and beyond and those sorts of things. And then I would say performance is probably the other one as well. So we are very big on our performance metrics, and that's not just individuals' financial performance or their utilization targets or revenue targets, those sorts of things. It's the personal goals and the growth and development goals that people set for themselves as a process to help them connect their individual purpose to the purpose of the firm and the organization. So we've got some metrics that we can serve up around those sorts of things as well. I'd say they're probably the core, and then there's all of the other ones that sort of form the periphery around that, and they all interplay with each other. But yeah, those are the main ones that we're probably looking at on a regular basis.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Just before we move on from technology, I want to, a comment you mentioned right at the start in your introduction was that you advise HR tech companies on, let me just remind myself. Yeah, so it's what advice should HR tech companies take on board to be able to create HR technology that is going to be usable and effective in this hybrid work. And there's a lot of investment going into the HR tech world and health tech. And, I'd love your thoughts on how that investment can be, channeled in ways that really makes HR leaders lives easier and helps them feel more in control of, a company's most valuable asset.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that is very, very relevant at the moment. And what I would say is, what it's not is buying a whole bunch of HR technologies to build up an HR tech stack in the hope that those technologies are going to somehow fix all of the problems. And that sort of tends to be the way that it goes, right?
Definitely.
We've got this people problem.
All the time.
Yeah, we've got this problem with people, so let's go buy this fancy bit of kit that's going to solve that problem. But that really doesn't work. And what you end up getting is this kind of cobbled together offering of all of these different technology products with the different, look and feel that probably don't talk to each other and have, 50 different databases that are all in isolation. And, they might be serving a certain purpose and they might be fixing those 50 problems. But really, when I think strategically about this and when I talk to the HR tech providers about it, what I'm saying I want them to be going to clients when they're doing their pitches or their demo meetings is that, I want them to be offering consulting advice as well as the solution and the product. And what that means is, you want to think first about what's the employee experience, or what's the, in the case of technology, what's the human user experience, and is that going to be of a kind of grade and expectation that most employees and humans are used to at the moment, which is the kind of Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok style of technology that people are using every day, several times a day. And if it's not, you're going to be fighting for the headspace of Gen Z and Gen X and the millennials who will just expect that any digital experience is going to be on the same level as that. So think about employee experience first, then think about how that employee experience is going to be enhanced or improved based on whatever process it is that that technology is trying to take people through, because that's typically what HR technologies are about, right? You've got sort of a core human resource information system, this, the record management system, and then a bunch of other things that float around that enable all of these different processes or different transactions in the employee life cycle. That's the typical model. And so those processes all need a beautiful, well-oiled piece of kit to work. And what you don't want to be doing is buying some technology and dropping it in and then going, oh no, now I've got to change that process. Or now we need two processes because the technology doesn't enable that process. And then the third thing in the thinking in the equation of digital experience, and mostly now digital transformation for a hybrid working environment, is what is the technology? And the technology should come third and enable the process and enable that good user experience, right? Not the other way around, which is typically what happens. And what I have found in the big companies I've worked for, but also when I talk to the CrewMojos of this world who are out there talking to clients, is that, companies will have dozens, if not more, bits of HR technology that they've just been buying and buying over the years and scrambling. And that's doubled in the last 2 years with working from home and the pandemic, spending potentially millions of dollars on these things. Some of them are doing the exact same thing or have features that, do the exact same thing, but nobody has any clue about how much it's costing or when they're renewing. So I think when you think about it all again in a more holistic and a strategic way, you can consider your whole HR technology ecosystem as being a kind of an offering to enhance the employee experience and the culture, and then work back from that on process, and then what are the right bits of kit to buy in the most efficient way.
No, I love that. I was talking to another head of people and culture yesterday, and she was describing that situation. She likened it to having like a garage, all these pieces of technology just kind of thrown in there, and not quite sure what's in there and where the value lies. So
you're right. And sometimes you just got to get on Marketplace or Gumtree or eBay and sell off a bunch of those things.
So true. And
or give it away for free and just stop using it, right? And that's the funny thing, actually, Lawrence, about HR technology or any technology at the moment. It becomes superseded so quickly now. Like you might spend a year going to market and looking for something that you think is perfect and is going to be fit for purpose and fit for right now. And then you go through implementation and you get it in, and all of a sudden 18 months has passed. And then some new, better version of it just comes along out of the blue and totally trumps it. But you might be on a 3 or 5 year term with that particular bit of kit. And so you kind of, with technology now, have to be thinking really quick and almost be thinking in years, which the procurement teams don't really like, as opposed to 3 or 5 years, because it moves so quickly and it iterates real fast.
It really does. There's so much innovation actually happening that you really want to ensure, I guess, that you're working with companies who are going to be innovating themselves, because that becomes frustrating if your platform is not as current as it could be. Wonderful. I'm just going to move on. I know we're almost out of time, but one other area that I'd love to talk to you about is, I did some work last year with Indigenous cultures, and it was really interesting for me, coming from England and learning a lot more about the Indigenous Australian culture. And I guess from a wellness point of view, what struck me is that the way the Indigenous cultures, Indigenous people look at the world, it's like true wellness. We talk about wholeness or holistic living, but the way they understand the connection between people and the natural world feels that they've got that bit right, and we could learn a lot from the way they live their lives and really bring that wisdom into our workplaces. But I'd love I know this is an area that you're passionate about as well, and I'd love your thoughts on how we can integrate some of that ancient wisdom, some of that knowledge that has been around for thousands of years. Let's face it, it's not a new thing, and really help to solve some of the problems that we have today in Western kind of short-term culture. There was one thing that really struck me, I remember, and it was how the Indigenous people plans for 7 generations ahead. And it's like, wow, like we planned for 7
Yeah.
months ahead. It's like, it was like so different.
Yeah.
So I'd love your thoughts on how we can learn.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, and it is definitely an area of both interest and passion and advocacy, and infancy, I would say, for me in terms of my experience. And I'm on the Deloitte Truth and Reconciliation Action Planning Committee as well, and it is certainly something that Deloitte are very much focused on. And both here, but even before I came here, was an area for me that has always been a sort of a fascination and an interest, but something that I've become much more proactive about more recently, and actually participating more in and working with Indigenous people and First Nations organisations and companies, and even to the point of investing in some First Nation owned and led companies to give that sort of level of support. But look, for me, I'm with you. This, thinking 7 years in the future, sorry, 7 generations into the future for our decision making now, but also learning from and drawing on 7 generations in the past to understand what works and what doesn't work. And for Australian First Nations people, that's taking 80,000 years of experience and trial and error and refinement to get to the point now where, yes, that sort of systems thinking and that understanding of the interconnectivity between people and between us and country and everything else above and below is so important in the way in which we live our lives now and the decisions we make now, but what that means for our kids and 7 generations into the future. So it kind of all galvanized for me, I would say, 10 years ago, when I lived in the UK for 10 years, and I came back to Australia about 8 years ago. And 10 years ago, I was invited to go to Orlando and Florida in the US and go to the Johnson & Johnson Human Performance Institute and do a program over there, a training course called the Corporate Athlete Program. And what I found is that program was excellent. And it taught me a lot personally that I could then use to shape the workplace wellbeing offerings that I was responsible for. But it was in an environment that was really, really manufactured. And I don't know if you've ever been to Disneyland or you've been to Orlando
I
and
have,
Florida.
yeah, I have,
Just
yeah. I
everything's
know what you mean.
built, right? There's not much nature. And it kind of gave me this real craving to come back to the bush in Australia, because I'd spent a lot of time in the bush when I was a kid. And I really, really wanted that after living in the US and the UK for 10 years. And I kind of came back, and as soon as I got back, I really started to immerse myself in a personal learning journey about Indigenous Australia and about connecting to country and connecting with First Nations people. And even though I'd lived, for many years in Australia, it wasn't really until I came back that I understood this kind of deep, deep need and desire to connect with country and to connect with the place in which, and to become a custodian of the land that I was on at the time, to the point where I went and got myself a couple of hives of native Australian stingless bees. So I've been keeping stingless bees now for many, many years. It's like one tiny little connection, or growing native bush tucker food in my backyard. All of these sorts of things have helped me to become more educated and aware and become more of an ally and an advocate and a champion for drawing on First Nations wisdom and then trying to factor that into these very Western ways of doing things in the workplace. And Deloitte's been fantastic at that, I would say, in sort of evolving that and elevating that agenda in the workplace, to the point where now we've even got a job that's a current open job that we're looking for, which is a senior manager, First Nations background individual who can help us to shape a First Nations advocacy agenda within our workplace for the kind of 30-odd Indigenous employees that we currently have, but also just the way in which we build out that level of cultural awareness and understanding, and that's sort of more deeply embedded into the way that we do business from now on. So that's like a really good, tangible piece of evidence for a company that's becoming much more enlightened as to just how important Indigenous cultural awareness is for our Western way of working.
I love that. Thank you very much for sharing. Now that's a really big, so I didn't realize you were doing that, but that's a huge leap forward, and hopefully a good model that other companies can replicate. Definitely something I'd love to cover at our Wellbeing at Work Summit,
Yeah.
in November. I think that would be a really good topic to pick up on. Okay, so we're almost out of time. So the last question I always ask everybody is, this podcast is called the Find an Equilibrium Show, so it's all about balance in different ways. When I say those words to you, finding equilibrium, what does that mean for you? I'd love your perspective on that. And also, what do you do personally on a day-to-day basis to help you find equilibrium? You've described your life, two big hats and lots of other hats that we haven't even touched on, I'm sure. But I'd love to know how you find your equilibrium every day and don't get out of balance.
Yeah. I mean, we had a joke before we started that over the years I've built up a very thick rhinoceros skin and become much more resilient to the negative effects of everything that throws me out of whack and out of equilibrium. So I think that having a bit of a sense of humor about it is one of the ways that helps me become more level, and realizing that what I do, people are not necessarily going to die as a result, and so not getting too immersed and sucked into the vortex of everything that could go wrong, but thinking much more optimistically about what could go right and how could it go right. For me, I'm a saltwater person. I live saltwater country here, Manly in Sydney in Australia. And I have always had this philosophy that if things are throwing me off balance or out of whack or out of equilibrium, all I need to do is find salt water in one of its three main forms, which is sweat, tears, or the ocean. And if I can get into one of those three states through, exercising or crying or jumping in the ocean, I go surfing, paddleboarding, I go out in the bush, mountain biking. I've got kids that I run around after and take them to sport. The bees in the garden, the bush tucker plants, all of these sorts of things combine to help me to get back to that level of equilibrium. And for me, it's not so much about balance anymore. It's more about integration. And it's more about, if I am forced to be in a position where I'm working from home and, we can't go in the office for whatever reason, or, I'm trying to juggle a lot of things at the same time, then I just have to remind myself that, if I can get out on country, or I can take my shoes off and I can be in the ocean or be on the land, then that's much more centering and grounding. And for those few minutes, I can, get level and get back to normal. And that helps me to thicken up that rhinoceros skin when I go back into battle.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. I love your example about going to Florida, because I had exactly the same thought when I was there. And I remember there was a whole, I think a Crocodile Dundee ride. And I think that really kind of highlighted the artificial nature of what Disneyland tries to create, and we can easily take for granted the amazing country and land that we have around us, and I think sometimes you have to go away to appreciate what you have. And
Yes.
but listen, thank you so much for spending some time with us. I know you've got a lot on. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you do, and get in touch if they want to?
Yeah, so my pleasure to spend some time with you, and thank you so much for the great questions and the fact that you're raising awareness and enhancing people's understanding of these concepts. Probably the best place to find me is on LinkedIn, or you can just Google me, Breckon Jones, and there tends to be a few non-controversial websites that send people to my profile. I'm also on the CrewMojo webpage as part of the advisory board there that talks a bit about that work that I do externally. And they're probably the best ways. If we're getting back to conferences in person in the next couple of years, then certainly come and find me and say g'day at a conference as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Breckon. Let me acknowledge you for the amazing work that you've done and continue to do, really championing change and bringing together so many different concepts and strategies to really create work that leaves people, I love this, leaves people better than they started. You know, work should be an enhancer of well-being. And I think sometimes we just don't believe that to be true. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you everyone for listening and for watching. And we will see you next time. Thank you.